In the first scene, we see a boy named Miguel Alves enter his mother's workshop, where she was supposed to be working, and witness a terrifying scene. On the morning of 2 days earlier, the successful psychologist Grace Fraser was getting ready for work in a hurry as usual. Grace is married to Jonathan, an oncologist, and they have a 12-year-old son named Henry. He dreams of having a dog, but his parents forbid it because Jonathan is allergic. Today Grace is going to attend a charity tea party and hopes her husband will also be present. However, Jonathan has other plans. Henry attends the elite Reardon School. Overall, the Fraser family is quite wealthy, but on the other hand quite ordinary. Jonathan was walking his son to school. Henry shared that his music teacher considers him untalented. However, despite this, the boy does not want to quit violin lessons. Jonathan, who has been looking very tired lately, supported the son in this. Meanwhile, Grace arrived at her office and conducted a psychotherapy session with her regular patient Rebecca, who emotionally complained about her third husband Kevin. Grace believes that the patient belongs to the type of people who are meticulous about every aspect of their lives except for choosing a life partner. Obviously, Rebecca did not want to accept the unpleasant truth about herself. During a break, Grace called the husband and told him that the patient had given up on her. However, Grace was not at all upset about this. She managed to persuade her husband to attend the charity tea party today. After all, it's about Henry's school, so it's for his sake. Grace personally met with members of the parent committee. Elena Alves, who recently gave birth to her second child, is a newcomer among the mothers. Her older child Miguel is in the 4th grade. The little girl is named Teresa. The women discussed preparations for the upcoming auction. Elena unashamedly breastfed her daughter right at the table, which slightly embarrassed the other women. Later, Grace received a call from her friend Sylvia Steinites, and they discussed Elena's inappropriate behavior during the meeting. It was at least tactless. Additionally, Sylvia had noticed Elena's strange behavior before. While pregnant, Elena could sit for hours on a bench opposite the school and do nothing. The next morning, Grace also told her husband about Elena's vulgar behavior, as if she wanted to demonstrate that she was a real mother and was having difficulties because of it. Grace would like to move. Life in Manhattan has tired her, and it clearly does not benefit their son. However, Jonathan is satisfied with everything. During the day, Grace went to the gym, and after training crossed paths with Elena in the shower, who thanked her for the warm welcome yesterday. Grace was a little confused because Elena still hadn't dressed. Of course, Grace later told her husband about it. Elena's behavior clearly goes beyond normal. Jonathan is going to an oncology conference in Cleveland tomorrow, but now he and his wife are attending a charity reception at Reardon School. The event was organized at the highest level. Principal of the school Robert Knaver thanked the Fraser couple for finding time to come. Franklin Reinhardt, Grace's father, was also present. They agreed to have dinner on Thursday, and Franklin left. All the mothers and their husbands socialized with each other, while Elena felt out of place. She wore a provocative dress, so she immediately caught the attention of the men. However, Elena was indifferent to them. She only looked at Grace. It was time to start the auction. Sally Mabry, the head of the auction committee, delivered the opening speech. The event was held to enable less privileged parents to afford education for their children at Reardon School. While in the restroom, Grace found Elena crying. Out of politeness, Grace asked if everything was okay. The girl said that sometimes she felt lost. As a psychologist, Grace offered her a free consultation if necessary. Elena thanked Grace for her kindness and hurried to leave the auction. Grace followed her into the elevator to make sure she was okay. Suddenly Elena kissed her and thanked again. Grace didn't understand what it meant and returned to the auction. When Jonathan asked what happened, Grace replied that Elena was upset and decided to leave. In the evening, receiving an urgent call from the clinic, Jonathan also left, and Grace stayed at the party. At night, Grace couldn't sleep, thinking about her husband, who works as a pediatric oncologist and worries about each of his young patients, cheering them up. Jonathan returned very late. From his reaction, Grace realized that he couldn't save the patient and said how sorry she was. By the way, Elena never came home, so her husband Fernando was taking care of the children alone. Fernando was sure that his wife was working in her workshop. They live in a modest apartment. Miguel was supposed to catch the school bus, but instead, he went to his mother's workshop. At the same time, Grace asked her son to hurry up, or they would be late. Henry began to suspect that his father actually wasn't allergic to dogs. Grace admitted that he indeed wasn't allergic. Jonathan's unwillingness to have a dog was due to a childhood trauma when his beloved pet was hit by a car, and the parents blamed him for it. Later, during a session where a couple tried to work through their problems after infidelity, Grace received a call from Sylvia, who told her that today Elena was found lifeless in her workshop. There is no official version yet, but rumors suggest that it was not an accident but a crime. The worst part is that Elena was found by her own son. More is unknown. Grace was shocked. Of course, Elena was strange and had been bothering her lately, but overall she hadn't done anything wrong. Detective Joe Mendoza interviewed all members of the parent committee. No one had any close contact with the victim. Elena's family wasn't wealthy, her son attended the elite school on a scholarship. Grace tried to call her husband, but he didn't answer the phone. Grace thought that Jonathan was busy at the conference in Cleveland. Detectives Paul O'Rourke and Joe Mendoza approached her on the street and asked to answer a few questions. Grace readily agreed, telling them everything she knew. The detectives wanted to interview Jonathan as well, but Grace said it was impossible because he was currently in Cleveland. Tuition at Reardon School costs $50,000 a year. Grace knows nothing about the financial situation of the Alves family. She only knows that their son attends on a scholarship. Before leaving, Joe Mendoza left Grace's calling card. Henry questioned the mother about the details. He doesn't know Miguel, but he heard rumors that Elena's husband was involved in the crime. However, these are just speculations. The detectives, trying to speak as gently as possible, questioned Miguel. His mother was an artist and often spent time in her workshop, but that morning Miguel immediately sensed something was wrong. Grace still couldn't reach her husband and began to get nervous. Grace's paranoia intensified when she discovered that Jonathan's phone had been in the house all this time. It turns out he accidentally or intentionally left it here. Grace called the hotel in Cleveland where Jonathan was supposed to stay, but it turned out he hadn't checked into that hotel or any other. Grace doesn't know what to think. Henry also hasn't spoken to his father since he left in the morning. The boy became worried upon learning that his father left the phone. Neither Grace nor Henry knows the password. The news reported on the terrible incident. The crime was committed with particular cruelty. Like Grace, Sylvia can't believe this happened to Elena. Grace couldn't sleep. The son tried to comfort her. Perhaps the father accidentally forgot his phone, so he just had no way of contacting them. A call came to Jonathan's phone from an unknown number. Grace answered, but the unknown caller immediately hung up. Grace tried to calm down but couldn't stop thinking about her last conversation with Elena. No one can imagine the horror Miguel felt when he found his mother lifeless. Only a true monster could commit such a crime. Morning came, and still no word from Jonathan. Grace took her son to school. Dozens of journalists had gathered here. This story had become a sensation. Sylvia introduced Grace to Alexis, the mother of one of the second graders. Alexis would like to get a consultation with a psychologist for her daughter Kimberly, who is now afraid to go to school. The mothers discussed who could wish harm to Elena. Many are convinced it was her husband. Noticing Detective Joe Mendoza looking at her, Grace got nervous and hurried to leave. In the office, Grace asked the secretary to contact the chief physician at the clinic where Jonathan works. Listening to patients, Grace couldn't focus on what they were saying. All her thoughts were occupied with where Jonathan could be right now. Time passed very slowly. Arriving at her husband's clinic, Grace asked Dr. Stuart Rosenfeld, his supervisor, if Jonathan had called him. Stuart looked confused and didn't want to talk. When Grace mentioned the conference in Cleveland, he seemed to not understand what she was talking about. Failing to get any answers, Grace was forced to leave. Jonathan was always dedicated to his work and worried about every patient, but could he be hiding something? Picking up her son from school, Grace went to her father's place with him. She is sure that Jonathan intentionally left his phone and made sure it wouldn't be found. Franklin asked his daughter about her relationship with the husband the day before his disappearance. Grace replied that they were doing well, better than ever. The detectives came to talk to Grace again, who was puzzled. Nevertheless, Grace agreed to ride with them to the police station. On the way she called her father, who thinks it was a bad idea to agree to talk to the police. However, Grace wants to figure everything out. At the station, the detectives began questioning her about the husband. From them, Grace learned that Jonathan hasn't been working at the clinic for several months. It was a shock for Grace. According to Joe Mendoza, Jonathan was fired for inappropriate contact with a patient's family member. Grace refused to believe it because her husband is a very kind and caring person. Despite the official statement from the clinic and other records, Grace continued to deny everything. Joe Mendoza gave the patient's name, Miguel Alves. Accordingly, it was about the mother of the boy, Elena Alves. The detectives suspect that Grace is covering for her husband. Grace didn't want to continue this conversation and left. She still didn't want to believe that there was anything between her husband and Elena. Calling the daughter, Franklin immediately understood that something was wrong and asked her to come right away. Barely keeping her composure, Grace said she would come as soon as she gathered all the necessary things from home. Grace couldn't calm down, feeling physically unwell. Her perfect marriage turned out not to be so perfect. Grace decided to go through her husband's things, hoping to find clues. She found a woman's headscarf and perfume that clearly didn't belong to her. Grace remembered that Elena used such perfume. Grace arrived at her parents' house only by morning. During breakfast, Henry looked up the news about the incident with Elena Alves on the internet. Suspicions about her husband were lifted because he has a reliable alibi. On the way to school, Henry asked the mother directly if his father was a suspect. Grace denied it, assuring her son that the police just wanted to talk to his father, But Henry didn't believe her. Near the school, Grace noticed that the teacher was looking at her strangely. Robert Knaver, the school principal, asked Grace not to show up here for now. It would be better if someone else picked up Henry from school. Grace realized with horror that everyone already knew that Jonathan was the main suspect. The other moms looked at her as if she were the culprit. Sylvia was the only one who didn't turn away from Grace. She wanted to know what others were saying. Sylvia said that Elena's husband does have an alibi. Sylvia also admitted that some time ago Jonathan hired her as a lawyer. There was a disciplinary hearing regarding Jonathan's misconduct towards the mothers of patients. Elena was far from the only one. Jonathan turned to Sylvia for advice, but it didn't help because there were more than enough grounds for dismissal. Sylvia hadn't told Grace about this before because she isn't allowed to disclose confidential information about clients. Now Sylvia advises Grace to leave with her son as far away as possible for their safety. When Jonathan is found, it will be a huge scandal. Her father holds the same opinion, believing that his daughter and grandson should leave for a while. Grace doesn't want to because she has a job here, and Henry has school. Grace saw journalists near her house. The police were already searching their apartment. Joe Mendoza showed her the warrant. Experts seized all potential evidence, including a hairbrush for DNA analysis, to conduct a paternity test on Elena's little daughter. This was demanded by the victim's husband. Grace's life turned into a nightmare. Being an experienced psychologist, she couldn't recognize the warning signs and lived in deception. Her husband wasn't who he pretended to be. Grace took the son to their beach house. Henry didn't want to stay here, but they couldn't return until the press frenzy subsided. This really angered Henry, who believes his mother simply ran away. At some point, Grace noticed a silhouette in the distance, which almost immediately disappeared. Grace couldn't stand looking at family photos. She trashed the room, shouting how much she hated her husband. Henry saw this. Now they have to stick together and support each other. For the sake of her son, Grace tries to keep herself together. During dinner, she noticed the silhouette upstairs again. At night, Grace woke up to the sound of footsteps. It seems there's someone else in the house. Grace searched all the rooms but didn't find anyone. Unable to sleep, she just sat on the porch. Suddenly Jonathan appeared and grabbed her, urging not to scream. Jonathan didn't deny that he had an affair with Elena, but the man insisted he didn't harm her. Grace intended to call the police. She gave Jonathan her whole life, and in return she got betrayal. Jonathan repeated that Elena was obsessed with him and his family. That evening after the auction, Jonathan and Elena argued, and it turned into passion. After that, Jonathan left, and when he returned Elena was already lifeless. Grace realized that on that fateful night, her husband was upset not because of the patient's demise. Jonathan insisted that it was Elena who did everything to make him lose his job. Awoken by screams, Henry came out to the parents. While Jonathan hugged his son, Grace called the police. Soon the police arrived by helicopter and arrested Jonathan. He didn't resist. Henry watched from the window as the officers took his father away. To distract himself, Henry played the violin while detectives questioned Grace about how her husband came to be here. She feels like the police officers don't believe her. The DNA test results came in, showing that Teresa is Jonathan's daughter. Grace was too exhausted to feel strong emotions about it. Jonathan, along with other inmates, was taken to prison. Henry and Grace are staying with her father. Henry keeps track of all the news related to Elena's case, which Grace doesn't like. Franklin is ready to help his daughter in any way he can. She assured him that she has money, although Jonathan spent a decent amount from their account. Henry is as broken as his mother. Now he has to live with the fact that his father is a criminal. Grace talked on the phone with Sylvia, who advised her to hire a lawyer because the police might suspect her of being an accomplice. Grace doesn't even want to entertain the idea that the police are actually considering such a version. The first court hearing took place, with many journalists present. Sylvia was also here to pass on all the news to Grace. Jonathan's lawyer was Robert Adelman, and the prosecutor was Catherine Stamper, a very strict woman. Elena's husband Fernando, of course, was also present. The judge declared the court session open and set bail at $2 million. After a short hearing, Jonathan was taken back to his cell. All the news is talking about this case. Henry feels how scared his father is. Jonathan had to get used to prison routine. A week later he met with his lawyer, who advised him not to communicate with any of the inmates. Any information can be used against him. Of course Jonathan doesn't have $2 million to post bail. He insists on his innocence, but the lawyer doesn't care. Moreover, Robert prefers guilty clients because it's easier to work with them. For now all the evidence points to Jonathan. Right now he just wants his lawyer to arrange a meeting with his wife. Robert Adelman met with Grace in a cafe and asked her to confirm Jonathan's innocence in court. However, Grace is not ready to do that. Now that Grace knows her husband is a traitor and a liar, she believes he is capable of much worse things. Franklin doesn't want his daughter to meet with Jonathan. Grace is hesitant. For Henry's sake, She would like to at least get a hint that her husband might be innocent. The mother and son are not ready to accept that their closest person is a monster. Now Grace can't leave the house peacefully because she immediately attracts the attention of journalists. Everyone wants to know what the criminal's wife feels. In the taxi, Grace cries out of helplessness. She dared to meet her husband in prison after all. He was really grateful to her. The worst part is that their son is suffering because of this situation. Now Grace knows that Jonathan has an illegitimate daughter. He had nothing to say in his defense, but nevertheless, despite everything, he hopes that the wife will help him. Right now the whole world is against Jonathan. Everyone believes he's guilty. Grace doesn't know what to believe anymore. But even if her husband is innocent, she's not going to help him. Grace's world is shattered, as is the perfect image of her husband, who saved the lives of the youngest patients. Stuart agreed to talk to Grace, although he doesn't want to be involved in this story. According to Stuart, Jonathan and Elena didn't even hide their affair. It didn't seem like Elena was obsessed with him. Jonathan clearly enjoyed her attention. Deep down, Grace still wants to believe that her husband is not capable of such things. On the street, Grace crossed paths with Fernando, who silently walked past her. Right now he is forced to take care of Teresa, who isn't even his daughter. Grace shared with her father the thought that perhaps Elena just fell in love with the doctor who saved her son's life. Jonathan in turn clearly suffered from a god complex. Unlike his daughter, Franklin doesn't entertain the thought that Jonathan might be innocent. Franklin admitted that some time ago, Jonathan asked him for $500,000, allegedly to pay for Henry's education and cover other expenses. Franklin gave Jonathan the money, knowing that the daughter would never ask him for anything herself. Now Franklin regrets not telling her about it right away. Perhaps if he had acted differently, Elena would still be alive. Grace took her father's hand in a gesture of support. In the evening, Franklin walked down the street and saw through a window how Fernando took care of little Teresa. Grace decided to allow the son to see his father. Henry really needs it. Entering the visitation room, Henry became nervous. This place was permeated with an atmosphere of hopelessness. People come here who cannot be with those they hold dear. Seeing his son, Jonathan couldn't hold back tears. Henry directly asked the father if he was guilty. Jonathan denied it, but his innocence doesn't negate the fact that he betrayed his family by having an affair. Jonathan continued to insist that Elena was obsessed with him and pursued him. When the son asked why he fled the crime scene, Jonathan replied that he was simply scared. Unable to bear it, Henry burst into tears. The thought that they would never be a family again was unbearable. That evening, Grace told the father that she wanted to hire the best lawyer for her husband, Haley Fitzgerald. Despite everything, Grace believes that the monster who took Elena's life wasn't Jonathan. Franklin agreed to help his daughter with this. Jonathan sank into depression, seeing no way out of the situation. He became a celebrity, but it wasn't the kind of fame he had dreamed of. One of the inmates began to bother Jonathan, leading to a fight. Prison guards had to break up the two men. As Grace walked down the street, she didn't notice Fernando with the stroller following her. She met with Haley Fitzgerald, who had already reviewed the police reports. Grace is doing this not for Jonathan, but for her son. If his father turns out to be guilty, it could ruin his life. Haley directly said that the evidence is not in Jonathan's favor. As an experienced lawyer, Haley can win almost any case, but that doesn't mean Jonathan will actually be innocent. Grace understands this and is willing to take the risk. The detectives approached Franklin and said that the police suspect Grace of being an accomplice to her husband. Of course, Franklin thought this was nonsense and refused to cooperate. The detectives had to leave with nothing. This time Fernando Alves dared to speak to Grace. She didn't want to, citing it as an inappropriate moment, but Fernando insisted. Grace remains convinced that Jonathan wasn't the one who took Elena's life, but someone else. Besides, Elena is no better than Jonathan because she allowed herself to have an affair with her son's doctor. Grace will defend her husband's innocence to the end because their son's future depends on it. Could Fernando have caught his wife being unfaithful and sought revenge? Grace went to the police station and told the detectives that Fernando was stalking her. In Grace's opinion, Fernando is hiding something. He's the only one with an obvious motive to harm Elena. However, the detectives ruled out Fernando as a suspect because he has an alibi. Grace demanded that the detectives show her the surveillance camera footage. It turned out that there were no cameras in the Alves family's house, but the nearest camera, located a block away from their house, recorded Grace walking there that night around the same time the crime was committed. Grace said in a panic that she often walks before bed and didn't even know where Elena lived. However, the detectives did not accept her arguments. Now Grace is suspected alongside her husband. Leaving the police station, Grace tried to comprehend what she had seen and heard. The next day she met with a lawyer who reassured her. The police had already obtained footage from other days, confirming that Grace often walked there. She is no longer considered a suspect. However, the police still believe that Grace may be covering for the husband to save her reputation. Right now Haley wants to know everything Grace is not telling her. But Grace had nothing to add because she's not trying to hide anything. Feeling terribly exhausted, Grace seeks support in her father. Finally, Jonathan met with his new lawyer. Jonathan had a bruise on his face from a fight with one of the inmates. Haley advised him not to get into more trouble. Now he needs to find $2 million for bail. The problem is Jonathan hasn't been in touch with his relatives for a long time, so no one can help him. Besides Elena, Jonathan had another affair in the past, also with a patient's mother. Haley wants to know the name of that woman. Grace met with Robert again to personally inform him that she decided to hire a private lawyer for her husband. Grace wants to ensure objectivity and asks Robert if he thinks Jonathan is guilty. Robert believes Jonathan is not a very good person but not capable of committing a crime. Later Grace shared with the father her intention to get Jonathan released on bail. Of course they won't live as one family anymore, even if he's eventually acquitted. Franklin decided to meet Jonathan personally. Franklin doesn't hide that he considers him guilty, but now there was a situation where he simply can't refuse his daughter. Franklin threatened Jonathan that if he ever tries to harm Grace or Henry again, he'll regret it. Franklin had nothing to lose anyway. After Franklin posted bail, Jonathan was released pending trial. Journalists followed him and Grace everywhere. Henry returned to school. There he encountered Miguel. Henry tried to be friendly, while Miguel remained silent. Henry was later summoned by the school principal, who asked what he talked about with Miguel. The boy replied that he just apologized to Miguel for bumping into him. Grace thanked her father for understanding and support. Franklin already regretted agreeing to this. He hadn't liked Jonathan from the very beginning, from their very first meeting. Grace was forced to deliver bad news. Henry is going to be expelled from school. The principal plans to switch him to homeschooling. The detectives visited again, finding it strange that Grace allowed her husband to return home. Moreover, Elena often called Grace shortly before her demise. Grace didn't know this because she never answers unknown numbers. When the detectives showed Grace her portrait Elena had drawn, she was shocked. Could it be that Jonathan was right, and Elena was truly obsessed with their family? Jonathan still hopes the wife will forgive him, but Grace made it clear he's no longer her husband. Grace will never be able to forgive him for such betrayal. Henry continues to follow the news. Many are unhappy that Jonathan was released on bail. Franklin decided to visit his grandson's school and ran into Sylvia, who genuinely worries about him, Grace and Henry. They're all holding on as best they can. Franklin is here to talk to the principal about Henry's expulsion. Franklin has invested too much in this school and made it clear he won't allow his grandson to be expelled for the school's reputation. Otherwise, Robert Knaver will deeply regret it. At night, Grace had nightmares about Elena drawing her portrait. Elena's obsession threatened to turn into something ominous for all of them. Unable to sleep anymore, Grace went for a walk. At some point she felt like someone was following her. It was Fernando. Morning came, and Grace still couldn't find the strength to return home. Her life had divided into before and after. Unable to handle the stress, she simply passed out. Franklin and his grandson came to the hospital. Grace was in the ward and looked very exhausted. Upon learning what happened, Jonathan rushed to the clinic. He seemed genuinely concerned for his wife. Someone who truly worries about Grace is Sylvia. She wants to help her friend but doesn't know how. Franklin first and foremost thinks about his grandson's well-being. On one hand, Henry is happy to return to school, but on the other, it scares him. Hearing the doorbell, Fernando expected to see anyone but Jonathan. He's here to explain himself. Fernando reluctantly let him in. Miguel couldn't hold back his tears. In front of him was the man who once saved him and who may have taken his mother's life. Telling his son to go to the room, Fernando asked Jonathan what he was trying to accomplish. Jonathan is truly sorry that he behaved unprofessionally and allowed himself to have an affair with the patient's mother, but that doesn't mean he's guilty. Fernando doesn't know what to believe. He allowed Jonathan to hold and feed Teresa, his daughter. Fernando is trying his best, but he really struggles to love Teresa. Learning that Jonathan violated the terms of his bail and made contact with a witness, Haley was furious. Jonathan genuinely thought he could persuade Fernando. Jonathan is usually good at that, charming people. With all the evidence pointing to Jonathan, Haley suggests he make a deal with the court and plead guilty, framing it as if he unintentionally took Elena's life. However, Jonathan refuses to do so because he is innocent. Haley decided they should conduct a televised interview. It's better if the public hears everything directly from Jonathan. Grace told her father that she always dreamed of a marriage like his and Mom's. Franklin admitted that their marriage was far from perfect. He constantly cheated on his wife, and she forgave him time after time. To make up for his guilt, Franklin gave her expensive gifts, but she never wore any of those jewels. The ideal image of her father was shattered for Grace. Perhaps she idealizes Jonathan in the same way to justify him in her own eyes. The father and daughter didn't know Henry was eavesdropping on their conversation. Jonathan and his lawyer gave an interview on national television. Jonathan said he wasn't the most deserving person, But he didn't want to hurt his wife and son. By the way, they were watching his interview on TV. Jonathan justified his fleeing the crime scene by being in a state of shock. At one point, Jonathan cried and said losing Elena broke him because he truly loved her. And Jonathan suspects who the real criminal is. Henry doesn't know whether to believe his father. Does the rest of the world believe him? Jonathan asked his wife how she ended up near the crime scene on that very night. It seemed a strange coincidence to him, and he started accusing his wife of spying on them. Grace couldn't believe her ears. Their argument was interrupted by curious teenagers who wanted to take their picture. Haley assured the Frasers that she had everything under control. The prosecution only has circumstantial evidence. Their advantage is that despite her husband's infidelity, Grace stood by his side. If she continues to play the role of a loving wife, the jury will believe them. But that's not all. They need to find another suspect, and Fernando Alves fits that role better than anyone else. Haley thinks his alibi is weak. Right now the most important thing for the spouses is to convince the jury that they still love each other. However, Grace doubts she can manage it, as she despises her husband. Franklin doesn't want to be involved in this circus called court, but for the sake of his daughter and grandson, he's willing to go through with it. At the same time, Franklin believes that Jonathan should stay as far away from Henry as possible for his own good. The courthouse was surrounded by journalists. Grace and Jonathan try to maintain their dignity, as does Franklin with Henry. Journalists eagerly sought interviews from each of them, but they did not speak to the press. At the courthouse they were checked with a metal detector and let in. Franklin liked this situation less and less. Catherine Stamper, representing the prosecution, insists that there is not a single piece of evidence in favor of Jonathan's innocence. He was seen with the victim on that fateful night, his DNA was everywhere. And the fact that Jonathan fled the crime scene only fuels suspicions. The weapon of the crime still hasn't been found. All that is known is that it was a sculptor's hammer. Listening to this, Grace didn't know what to feel. Haley calmly countered the prosecution's arguments, asserting that someone else harmed Elena Alves. Jonathan is simply a convenient suspect because of his affair with her. As the Frasers walked out of the courthouse, they were again surrounded by the press. Jonathan tries to keep himself together, knowing his freedom is hanging by a thread. Grace is currently living with the son at her father's house. When Jonathan called her at night, she answered. He feels uneasy being alone in the empty house. Grace misses her husband too, but she said no to his suggestion of having lunch together. Despite everything, Jonathan believes they can get their old life back. Unable to bear it, Grace eventually came home. Right now she needs her husband more than ever. Grace returned to the father's house only at dawn. Henry can't sleep, thinking about what awaits them in the future. Grace promised that they would overcome everything. Suddenly the son confessed that he saw his father and Elena together near the school some time ago. Now Henry regrets not telling his mother about it right away. Perhaps if he had acted differently, nothing bad would have happened. Grace reassured her son that it wasn't his fault. What was even worse, the father noticed Henry then too, and acted as if everything was normal. Henry didn't know what to do. The next day, Grace tearfully demanded explanations from Jonathan in front of their lawyer. Grace couldn't understand why her husband did this to their son. Jonathan had no excuses. The court session continued. Detective Joe Mendoza recounted how Fernando called the police immediately after discovering the body. When crime scene photos were presented, many in the courtroom felt sick. Haley countered all of Joe Mendoza's arguments that Jonathan was the only possible suspect. Although his DNA was found at the crime scene, it made sense because he and Elena had a secret affair. Grace had a motive, Fernando Alves had a motive, yet the police didn't seriously consider either of them as suspects. Street surveillance cameras captured Grace simply walking past that house. Fernando's alibi on the other hand was unconvincing. No one except his 10-year-old son could confirm that Fernando was home that night. Plus, Miguel was asleep most of the time. The Fraser family had dinner at a restaurant. Jonathan decided to talk to the son about the day he saw him near the school with Elena Alves. Jonathan sincerely regretted his mistake, but the past couldn't be changed. Henry wants to discuss whether their family will fall apart if they win the trial. Henry wants to believe that his parents won't get divorced. Jonathan also wants to believe that they can salvage their marriage, but Grace doubts she can forgive her husband. Atmosphere at the table was getting more and more heated. When Jonathan went to calm down, the wife followed him and asked what was wrong. At that moment, Jonathan admitted to another lie: he never had a dog. Many years ago it wasn't his pet that got hit by a car, but his sister Katie. At that moment Jonathan was 14 years old. The parents trusted him to look after his sister while they were away. Jonathan got distracted, and Katie ran out into the road. Talking about it, he cried. It was because of this incident that Jonathan decided to become a pediatric oncologist. It was a kind of redemption. Later, Grace discussed this with the father. She regretted that her husband had carried that burden alone for so many years. However, Franklin still thought Jonathan was a terrible person, as even his own family wanted nothing to do with him. The next day in the courthouse, Jonathan came face to face with Fernando. They did not say a word to each other. During the court hearing, Fernando testified. On that fateful day, he couldn't reach his wife, but it wasn't unusual because she often spent time in her workshop. Miguel didn't listen to his father, and instead of getting on the school bus, he went to his mother's workshop, where he found her lifeless. When it was Haley's turn to question the witness, he made it clear that he despised this circus. Fernando knows that Haley wanted to accuse him. Haley wants to know if Fernando guessed about his wife's affair and if Elena was undergoing psychiatric treatment. It turned out she did have some mental issues. But Fernando believes that aside from Jonathan, the wife was faithful to him. He could no longer contain his emotions and listen to these questions. After the hearing, Grace called Sylvia and asked her directly about their chances of winning the case. Sylvia doesn't hide that she believes Jonathan was involved in Elena's demise, but Haley is the best lawyer they could hire, so there's a chance. When Sylvia asked her friend what she thought about Jonathan's involvement, Grace preferred not to answer. Jonathan told his lawyer that he genuinely loved Elena, so he couldn't harm her. Haley advised her client not to portray himself as a good husband and father to the jury because he's neither. Jonathan just needs to behave like a person incapable of such a terrible crime. In the evening, Grace was surprised when Janet, Jonathan's mother, called her. They hadn't seen each other in many years, since the wedding. According to Janet, Jonathan himself decided to cut ties with his family. When Grace asked about Jonathan's younger sister, Janet said she really blamed her son because he was supposed to be watching over her. The worst part was that Jonathan didn't feel any guilt or sorrow. After Katie's demise, he never once expressed remorse, despite the family's support. After that conversation, Grace immediately called her friend to ask for advice. Now Sylvia has no doubts that Jonathan is a sociopath. All night, Grace couldn't sleep. Her son is all she has left. When Grace accidentally found a sculptor's hammer among Henry's things, her shock knew no bounds. At that moment Henry woke up. Grace demanded explanations from her son. Henry said he found the hammer in the fireplace of the beach house after they arrived. Henry decided to hide the hammer to save his father from prison. Now there is no doubt that Jonathan is guilty. When Grace told everything to her father and the lawyer, Jonathan tried to justify himself by saying that Fernando probably planted the hammer in the beach house to frame him. Since Henry had already washed the hammer in the dishwasher, it would be impossible to extract DNA and find out the truth. Although Haley is not entitled to do so, she strongly advised hiding or destroying the hammer. If the truth is revealed, Henry will be charged with obstructing justice. Jonathan asked his wife for a private conversation. He wondered if Henry could have taken Elena's life. The son saw them together and could have followed them. No parent can truly know their child well enough. Grace couldn't believe her husband was accusing their son of such a thing. Grace doesn't even entertain such a thought. Henry overheard their conversation and was deeply resentful of his father. Jonathan said it wasn't the voice of reason. The whole situation was driving him crazy. They need to stick together now. Franklin felt helpless, realizing that if Jonathan is acquitted, Grace will let him back into her life again. Grace hugged the father, promising to make everything right. In the middle of the night, Jonathan went somewhere, while Henry continued to browse the internet for all the news related to the case. Today will be another court hearing. The lawyer reminded Grace not to show any emotions. Any of her reactions could be used against her. On the contrary, Jonathan should not hold back. In court, Jonathan said he fled the crime scene because he panicked and was afraid his infidelity would be exposed. But he really loved Elena and Miguel, who became like a son to him during his cancer treatment. Jonathan doesn't consider himself cruel. On the contrary, his profession requires compassion and empathy. Catherine didn't believe a single word of the suspect. Since Jonathan is a doctor and should be able to make decisions in stressful situations, it's unlikely that the discovery of the body would have caused him to panic. When asked where he put the tuxedo he wore on the night of the crime, Jonathan said he took it to the dry cleaners. These words finally convinced Catherine of his involvement. Outside, the Fraser couple was waiting for the press, but they refused to answer any questions. Grace can't even imagine what her son is going through right now. Henry loves and yet hates his father, who destroyed their family. Grace just wants to do what's best for her son. Early in the morning, she called Sylvia and suggested going for a walk together. They met in half an hour. Grace wanted to ask her friend for a favor. It was time for the next hearing. To everyone's surprise, Haley called Miguel Alves as a witness. Haley asked the boy where his father was on the night of the mother's demise. Miguel replied that his father was probably home the whole time. But the boy couldn't be completely sure because he slept through the night. When asked if his parents ever argued, Miguel said sometimes. The arguments could be intense, and once Miguel told one of his teachers that he used to get scared. Catherine had no questions for the boy. In the restroom during the break, Sylvia approached Catherine, whom she knew personally. Fernando was extremely outraged that Jonathan's lawyer was asking his son such questions. For Miguel, who lost his mother, it was a tremendous stress. Security took Fernando out. Grace stated that she was ready to testify to evoke sympathy from the jurors. Haley doubted it was a good idea, but Jonathan supported his wife. Perhaps this was their chance. At night Grace can't sleep. Various thoughts race through her mind. She has to do the right thing now. The next court hearing began. Grace swore to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. Answering Haley's questions, Grace said that as a clinical psychologist, she believes her husband is not capable of cruelty and that he is a very compassionate person. It was time for the prosecution to ask questions. Catherine played Grace's 911 call that morning when her husband broke into the beach house and threatened her. This proves that Jonathan is capable of cruelty. Furthermore, Catherine told the jurors about an incident where Jonathan's younger sister had an accident, and he showed no grief. Even Jonathan's parents believe he is incapable of empathy. Haley tried to protest, but the judge overruled all her objections. It's obvious that Catherine got this information from Sylvia at Grace's request. Jonathan realized that his wife had changed her mind and decided to go against him. The entire defense strategy of Haley is falling apart. Clearly the witness was biased in her assessments. Grace confessed that she believes her husband suffers from narcissistic personality disorder and is incapable of feeling remorse. All this time, Grace deceived herself by covering for the husband. Love is often blind. Jonathan shouted that it was all lies, but the judge ordered him to sit down and be quiet. At that moment Sylvia was truly proud of Grace, and so was her father. The three of them left the courthouse together. Jonathan and Haley found themselves in a difficult situation. Grace set them up. Haley noticed Catherine smiling smugly. Many are convinced that Grace was in collusion with the prosecution from the beginning. Henry is angry with his mother for testifying against his father. Franklin explained to the grandson that it was necessary. Jonathan realizes that it's probably over for him. Because of the affair with Elena, he lost his family and his freedom. Henry continues to follow the news and communicate with his father. Grace is very tired of the media attention. Fortunately, the father is always there for her. Jonathan did not show up in court. Grace found this coincidence ominous, especially since Henry didn't come to school today. Henry thought his father was taking him to breakfast. The boy got nervous when the father took his phone away. Jonathan remembers how he threatened Elena that if she continued to seek meetings with his wife, she would regret it. Henry has been officially declared missing. Franklin and Grace personally took part in the search. Henry demanded his father to tell him where they were going. Jonathan avoided the answer. In the past, when Elena refused to accept his terms, he attacked her. Elena tearfully begged him not to leave, but Jonathan broke up with her anyway. Currently, Henry asks the father to stop the car, but Jonathan ignores the request, which only frightens his son even more. Jonathan believes that sometimes anyone can lose self-control, and that's completely normal. Henry knows that it was his father who took Elena's life. Indeed, in the past, when Elena tried to stop Jonathan from leaving, he took the hammer and did it. Now Jonathan justifies his actions by saying he wasn't himself. The police were already on their tail. Nevertheless, Jonathan didn't stop the car, continuing to drive forward. Henry shouted that it would only get worse, but his words had no effect. Grace could only hope that her son was okay. Breaking traffic rules, Jonathan almost caused several accidents. Henry was terribly frightened. Suddenly Jonathan stopped the car and stood on the edge of the bridge, about to take a step down. Henry shouted to his father to stop running away. Grace ran towards them, afraid that Jonathan would take the son with him. Fortunately, Jonathan changed his mind at the last moment. Grace reunited with her son, and Jonathan was arrested. For Franklin, the most important thing was that his closest people were unharmed. Jonathan watched as their helicopter flew away. Thus ended this story of lies and betrayal. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel not to miss more exciting new products. Also, the authors will be pleased if you leave your opinion in the comments.